So we're very excited to have this panel up here today. We decided to pick the topic of change agency because, we basically adapted to what we were seeing with registration. In April, Mills' sessions on change agency and being a change agent were the most packed sessions in terms of registration. And that seems to be a theme kind of running through this. We're all trying to change and change in different levels, in different ways. So I've brought up Dave Snowden and April Mills again. We also have Nies up here from the CTO of Rally, and has spent quite a bit of his work in changing organizazations. And also Erik Simmons from Intel has spent about his whole career in change agency and is a well-regarded expert in requirements engineering and systems thinking. So the format that we'll do here is I'll be the moderator and ask some questions, but it's all about these fine people at the top. And if we have time, we'll open up for you to ask questions. And so be thinking about that in the back of your mind. I got some submitted earlier, so thank you for those of you who did that. And the first question I have is, what do you do when the change you think would produce a good outcome is different from the change people think that they need?
Okay, I'll go first because everyone's listening quiet. First of all, you don't tackle those problems. If you want people to change, you need to find the problems they can't solve with the techniques that they're familiar with. Because the minute you try and put a novel technique in where they're used to a technique and they're comfortable, they won't listen to you. You find what we call the intractable problems, the ones where they can't solve them with conventional methods. And then you give them a route which has some possibility of achieving success. And then you achieve change. I think that's the key thing. The other key lesson is we need to shift away from this defining how we want people to behave. That's another one of these sort of, it's very common with systems thinkers. They want to define ideal behavior and close the gap. You need to change the way that people interact with problems so the behavior works out for itself. And that's one of the big changes. So, for example, I came up with your talk, Zach, all right? So kind of like, how do you manage that first cycle? One of the things IBM did very successfully, which worked, is they created what they called emergent business units. So if you got through that level of sponsorship, you got $1 million and you could do what the hell you wanted for a year and it might work or it might not work. Yeah? So they built a process to allow people to be mavericks. Gates Foundation do the same thing. So if your proposal doesn't get funding, you can write a 2-pager which will go to one of a series of 5 mavericks around the world. I'm one. And we get to allocate $100,000 to one that we think might work. So it's a structured process to allow diversity in the ecosystem, but not to actually challenge the way people think.
Any other thoughts?
One of the things I usually think about is if you're prescribing something around change and you're doing it without having empathy for the people who are involved in the change, there's a high chance you're going to really sort of miscommunicate or not understand the context of what's going on. When we do any type of change recommendations, we'll sit down, we'll do a bunch of empathy interviews or get them to tell stories or really try to get a sense of how did they get in this spot so that we can frame what we're thinking about and the things that we've seen that work in relation to their context. So I like to understand before talking.
I think it's appropriate that we're talking about change agency today as opposed to transition change management with the M word at the end of it. I think as a change agent, sometimes I'm a transition change manager's worst nightmare because I am out creating change, fomenting change, and I'm creating what would be a problem for somebody who seeks to manage change. And I want what Dave said. I want the sort of unmanaged, self-correcting, self-directing change that goes on instead of this managed thing where we define what's right and try to close the gap.
So how would you set a vision for change then if you don't really know what the direction is, or do you set a vision? If you want that kind of organic change, how would you set up the right mechanisms or structure, or how would you act in a way where you don't really know what the right answer is at the end of the day?
I'm not going first again. Right?
April hasn't
I just saw you smile.
All right.
So that.
All right, well, I'll go. I think a lot of times that first step out isn't to define, like Dave was talking about, that ideal, but is to say, what do I want more of or less of? and then either move towards the more or away from the less. So if you're saying, I want a system which has less overtime for folks but more productivity, you know, what does that look like? And maybe you don't have that full answer, but you go, what are we going to go try? So that's those safe to fail experiments to say what might work and shouldn't do damage, and how are we going to look at that? So you start out that way. So you at least have some direction. It's not, you know, Alice in Wonderland saying, I just want to go someplace. But you don't have that clear sense of exactly where you're going to be because you haven't been there yet.
To me, the times where I've seen vision work out well is it's kind of helping to establish this context for all the other things to be coherent within that context. So you have to give language, you have to give metaphor, you have to give the way for people also to kind of see themselves in the change, because anytime we talk about human change, the first thing I often think about is these are human beings, and these human beings are going to be affected by this change. And what's sort of the psychological disruption that's going to be involved in that? And how can I get to know that better? And how can I create an environment where it's okay for those feelings to come out, for those, you know, almost like a grieving process? Because in change, to some degree, you have to grieve that. And there's a natural human process that comes from that. So I like to match vision up with sort of the normal human psychology of the people involved.
So it's a great segue to, you know, you brought up the human connection and individuals' reactions to change. If you're really trying to transform something at scale or across groups, much of our work here at Intel and many companies is across many cultures, many different sites, and even companies that are new to the company, so we don't even have the same company culture. How do you do, you know, that sort of thing in that kind of environment where everybody, it may be different and may react to those metaphors differently?
I still think you're asking the wrong question, right? I mean, that's the Sengi approach. The Sengi approach is define a common vision, define common values, get people aligned with that. Yeah? And the good news is it's never happened, because if ever did happen, you'd destroy variety in the system and the system couldn't evolve. Yeah? I mean, there are different ways you can achieve direction. One is if you map the current narrative, something we do a lot of. And we're doing this in Colombia at the moment, which is a counter-narco product. And then you can, instead of going to people and saying, how do you create a culture of legality, which is a classic value statement, you say, how would we get people to tell more stories like this and fewer stories like that? Which is a form of engagement which you can get more people involved in. But then it's key that the stories don't come from facilitated consultancy workshops. They have to come from what we call distributed ethnography. Because if a consultant facilitates a workshop, the stories they get out are the stories the consultant expects to hear. Yeah? So you need authentic water cooler stories on that. Yeah? I talked in the keynote about heuristics. Heuristics provide guidance. There's also a very interesting thing about negative stories and more effective in provided direction than positive stories. Because what you can do with negative stories is define boundaries so that people funnel within the boundaries. And if you look at it historically, that's what fairy stories do. Yeah, traditional stories, until Disney got hold of them, right? One of the worst ever American contributions to world literature. Is fundamentally fairy stories are dark and negative because they're designed to teach children where they shouldn't go. They don't tell them what they should be, they tell them what they shouldn't be. Which actually is more liberating. It gives you more freedom within those boundaries. And I mean, the final method, which we're starting to develop a lot at the moment, are parable form stories. Because if you look at all the major world religions, and this goes beyond sort of the three religions of the book into Hinduism and Buddhism, all the world religions, teach through parable form stories. And if you look at the hermeneutics of parables, they introduce paradox and contradiction and ambiguity, which actually means they survive over time, but they still give moral direction. So I think there's a body of stuff we can do, but we need to start thinking about managing an ecosystem, not designing a machine. And all the language of mission, values, common purpose is actually the language of engineers designing the machine, not the language of ecologists dealing with an ecosystem.
On that, you actually, how would you recommend somebody to start to create those stories and understand their current culture if they're at a team level, right, versus a large organization?
At a team level? If you've got a team of under 15, you shouldn't be worrying about it. And under 15, you can know everybody, know their capabilities. If you get hung up on management speak and management process, you really are not a good team leader. Yeah, if you do good work, you give good examples, you talk with people, you help people, you coach them, you mentor them, you don't need the management speak stuff. The trouble is we're trying to scale downwards from things which are designed to work for whole organizations to small teams. And scaling down doesn't work any more than scaling up. Right? But even then, team stories tend to inherit from company stories. So the more stories like this, fewer stories like that, you're better running something at a company level and then team leaders picking it up and saying, how would we in our team create more stories like this and fewer stories like that? If you remember, it's a non-judgmental statement. You're not saying this is good or this is bad. You're saying more like this, fewer like that. There's enough ambiguity in that people can pick up on their own direction.
I'm curious what others think about treating change differently at the individual level versus the organizational level.
Well,
Go ahead.
okay. So what we've done is a lot of times tried to look at not getting teams to conform to some set of buzzwords or slogans, but instead saying, how do you see yourselves in this larger picture? And letting them define that, and then it's iterative back and forth along that. Then, okay, so here's what we want to accomplish as an organization, and the team says, well, we're going to go and take this piece on. And then you can ask those follow-on questions to say, well, how does that fit, or how do you see that fitting? And it challenges them to join into the larger system, but it doesn't tell them the answer. Because the problem is, a lot of times is you'll take leaders, they'll go off and pick the vision, they'll pick the 5 things that are acceptable to do, and then they'll go create conscripts to go do those 5 acceptable things that they never intend to do, usually. All these people should go do that while I continue on the same path. And that, I've never seen it work, not once. And yet, people keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it, instead of saying, here's where we'd all like to be, how do you see your group getting you there, and being open to that.
Yeah, this relates directly to the question on vision before, and we heard visual language of the picture in your answer and things that say that if there's a means-ends test you have to apply to the vision, and the vision is that, Scott, you were going to go do these 5 things for me. That's not much of a vision. That's right at the end of my nose. If the vision is something that paints that picture correctly, it becomes the driving force rather than a detailed description of a particular destination. And if that's what's at work, then it's fine. Otherwise, I'm deeply suspicious of corporate level change, because it is quite sufficiently buzzwords and way too much ends than means kinds of upside downness in that. We're told to go and do this specific thing rather than become this general thing.
There's also a very specific technique for high-performing teams, which is called the swimming pool test. So you take a new member, this is a metaphor, by the way, not physical, though you might do it physically. You take a new member of the team and you throw them into the deep end of the swimming pool. And you go and have a cup of coffee and see who's still swimming when you come back. And those are the people you work with. And I've done that over many years, and the people you get out of that are huge because they've been through something. You always put them in a swimming pool where if they do drown, there's a rescue, but they don't know about it, all right? And it's safe to fail. But until you expose people, this is what apprentice models do, expose people to see what they're capable of. And the key for a leader is you've got to know people's limits. Yeah, the first thing you do with new team is what are their limits, what are they capable of doing now, and you only get that by pushing them to the limits and seeing with a recovery plan. But the swimming pool test is one I strongly recommend. It's highly entertaining as well.
What are some ways that you've seen or used to accelerate change, and is that possible within an organic system?
The one that's kind of my litmus test is around moving furniture. There's something about the physical space that plays a big role in this. And when I see a team that has the autonomy to change their space and that space is set up to move, to me that's a real, it's actual and a metaphor for their capacity for change as a whole team. So for us, we encourage everybody has the autonomy to change their space. Each team can do whatever they want with their space, and we've designed a larger container for that, inspired by a lot of the metaphors that came out of Stanford's design school around pattern languages and small pieces of furniture that assemble and can be moved around. So those you can think of as sort of the building blocks. And to me, that's also for change, as a leader, if you can help people kind of establish some of those patterns and give them the metaphors around that, and then the autonomy to then take it and customize it for themselves. I mean, one of the distinctions that I'm often amused by is, do you follow a Catholicism approach or a Buddhist approach? So as you start scaling out these change, to what degree do you allow local variability, sort of the Buddhist approach, or where do you have this is the carbon copy and everybody's going to stamp it out within the teams? And I encourage teams to be intentional about that.
Which Catholic priest brought you up? That's a Protestant perspective. Yeah, never mind.
I'll cheerfully sit in the middle while this goes on.
Go and check on the Jesuits in Patagonia.
To go a slightly safer direction.
Yes.
There's at least a couple other concepts to throw into the physical space mix. One that's written on is called the absorptive capacity. If you've ever seen the Brawny paper towel commercial, the folks ask, what is the absorptive capacity for change within your organization? And like paper towel design, there are some things that you can do to create an organization that can withstand more change before it essentially starts to choke productivity. And you get the old, you're messing with my P&L, go away. Because at Intel, that's a defense mechanism we've all seen. You want to change, you want to adopt these new things, but somebody stands up and says, you're messing with my P&L, I'm going to be late if we do that. And then you're in a hole. And then the second one has to do with commitment escalation. And Marvin and I up there have been very interested, hello Marvin, in things like commitment escalation. The psychological, sociological, and other factors that cause somebody to cling to something when all evidence says it should be dropped. And for Intel folks, I would just point you to the cycles we've gone through of tool adoption and how much money we've spent on tools trying to get the tool to rule them all. There was one episode where the CEO issued a no options, you will all use that tool decree that this team tried to wield, and the commitment escalation there was so fierce it was unbelievable. And how many people use that tool now, Marvin? I think it's like 10? 0, actually. So it's dropped to 0. So commitment escalation is out there. We are victims of this, and people are clinging to things despite sunk costs and all the psychology that says it's really dumb to do this. So how do you increase the absorptive capacity of your organization for more change? And how can you shed stuff in the dude's talk? How do we shed things where we have commitment escalation going and we just can't drop it?
It's also worth remembering that you don't want to accelerate change across the whole organization because you couldn't absorb it. You want to accelerate change in a focused way. There's actually, for the Cynefin framework, there's a new domain model for complexity, and it talks about how you handle mavericks in a group. And there are 2 strategies for mavericks. One is you put them in a sandbox, which means you hide them away. So they got freedom, and that's increasingly difficult because organizations are excessively focused on transparency. And transparency is the enemy of innovation. It actually prevents people creating space for people to play if everything is visible. The other is starting to use employees approaching retirement or past retirement as mentors for people with novel ideas. And this is something which is much underused because you need people who can translate the ideas into terms that other people can understand. Yeah, you can't train them to do it themselves because then they wouldn't have the original ideas. Yeah? And I think there's a final thing which links on the space. I mean, you can physically change people's spaces for them. I had a financial director who was brilliant. He got fed up with gossip networks. So every 2 months, he and I would go in at the weekend and we moved people around. So they sat near different people. And they actually got to get very frustrated. One month we didn't do it and they got quite angry with us because they quite liked the novelty. And human beings do respond to novelty. It's a key factor, right? Give them something new, they'll respond accordingly. But there are 3 fundamental conditions for innovation. All of them need to be applied for fast accelerated teams. One is starvation of resource. If you give a team too much resource, they slow down, they don't speed up. Yeah, there's kind of like an optimal point at which you've got to starve them enough that conventional approaches won't work, but not so much that they can't discover the unconventional approach. Yeah? Then you've got to increase pressure. Yeah, and that can be painful, but sometimes you've got to do it. You've got to, set. It's like that we've got to have a man on the moon in the next 6 years. You need to set targets which are apparently unattainable to increase pressure. But you've also get people to see things from a different perspective. So some of the stuff I've done in my time, for example, is we use the Lutheran liturgical design specialist to work with doctors and nurses at a hospital in Bellingham. Because liturgical design is about compressing complex ideas into memorable form. I put biologists into engineering departments, anthropologists into hotels to study them for organizational change. So you need to actually put people under pressure, but give them different perspectives in parallel So that exaptive moment, that sudden innovation happens. And I think we need to make sure process doesn't become a dirty word. I mean, I gave a keynote last week where the title was "It's Process, Jim, but Not As We Know It." Right? I'm the Star Trek generation. Yeah, the process for complexity is different from the process for order, but it's still a process. And I think we over-focus on individual change and we don't focus enough on process change. And I think a lot of management techniques, particularly the pseudo-psychological techniques of the last 20 or 30 years, have been deeply patronizing because they've tried to define how people should behave or make an expert tell you why you're doing something wrong. If you change people's interactions, you change the situation, you change their space, they'll work out what sort of personality they want to be for themselves. Yeah, and that sort of builds, I think, on what you guys said. But we need a bit more discipline, a bit more structure. And I also think it is management, but just to make the change, the origin of the word manage in English is from an Italian word, menagere, the ability to ride a horse in dressage. So if you think about management as the ability to ride a horse in a dressage tournament, that's the sort of management you need to do. Yeah?
And picking up on those concepts, I'm curious, given the nature of our business, we are under deep or heavy pressure to change very quickly, and it's been overly constrained on people. And I mean, maybe you've experienced this, April and Erik and Zach, in your businesses, but how can we make it safer for people to change? And they're told that you have to work 24/7 to get this done, and it's not a safe environment. We don't necessarily have the leaders to put people into different situations and allow that change.
Well, I think we have to parse out what kind of change do they mean. So if you're asking me to change to a prescribed thing that you have come up with, have not tested, likely will not work, but you're going to measure me not on the outcome, but first on my conformity to your idea and then the outcome, they can't be shocked when it burns me out. Because in most of those cases, they haven't tested the validity that their change will actually work. But you're first measured on conformity to their change, then the outcome. So no matter what you do, you'll lose in that situation, I think. Yeah. I think it's universal across big bureaucracy, right? So instead, if the issue is, we need to get to this target, but I have no idea how to get there, you have free path, or I really want you to try this behavior because I'm really curious if it will work, and let's go test it. But one of those variables has to be free. And the second piece, when you talk about the 24/7, is we're obsessed with this notion of activity equals outcome. I get so frustrated when people say, we took 70 people offline for a week to talk about that. So what did you accomplish? If 2 people could have solved it in a day because you've been ignoring them for 10 years and they've already come up with a solution, how is 70 people for a week a benefit? So we've sort of misunderstood where the value is in change, both in who prescribes it and then how much effort equals its value. I want the one where it took you a day and you solved a huge problem, if I can get that. But a lot of people are measured by how long they're at their desk. And I've actually had people run that experiment of their boss telling them, even though they were getting all their work done, I really need you to come in on Saturday because we're falling behind. So the person came in on Saturday, didn't work at all, just sat at their desk, and on Monday their boss goes, I really appreciate that. We're looking for the wrong things.
So what are some things that you've done to actually change managers' perspective in that area?
Well, before we do that, I just wanted to add to that there's some work in Edgar Schein's domain that speaks to this conceptually very well. He talks about disconfirmation. And at Intel right now, we have a lot of disconfirmation in the mobile space, and we have some real challenges. The thing about disconfirmation, you can try to create some from within, but a lot of it comes from without. You can probably remember back to the days when we were getting beaten by AMD in a couple of market niches. And we're back in those days when, or that minor lawsuit we had in Europe. There were these little moments when we had some disconfirmation. Well, this creates survival anxiety. You're watching departures in your groups as people are being redeployed and laid off. That might be virtually, it's important survival anxiety, but we're all wondering what's coming at us, right? So we are now stuck with this slightly uncontrollable thing in disconfirmation. And now we need to get good at something, so we need to change. And now learning anxiety starts to bottle us up because I don't know how to do this new thing. And I'm going to be at least temporarily incompetent in this new thing. Maybe it's Agile or Lean in a new group. I don't know this Scrum thing. I'm scared of it. I'm going to be incompetent. My productivity may drop. And I'm trapped between two increasingly crushing walls. And if you look at that picture, your question was, how do you get people to change more easily? I can't control disconfirmation, but I can, in an organization, reduce learning anxiety. And I can make it safe, and I can release the pressure in the direction I want people to go by making it safe to learn. And these safe-to-fail experiments and all these concepts fit beautifully with Edgar Schein's ideas that you want to get people's learning anxiety low. So that, I think, is a great way to move people forward and define what forward is.
And April, in your talk, you mentioned kind of hitting the wall like Lewis and Clark. How do you keep the momentum going for a change? It's not just April, but for others, as change agents and, as a bigger initiative.
So a lot of times as people go through those slogs or those struggles, one of the steps I like in Kotter's 8 steps is the enabling change piece. And one of the things I find interesting is that a lot of times when people read that book, the empowering broad-based action, they assume means some leader someplace has to come in and do that. What you can do, no matter where you are in the organization, is if you see somebody who's trying really hard to make their change and they're going through a tough moment, just going up and telling them you're noticing it. I see how hard you're working and I can see that outcome and I support you. Or, hey, I just want to mention I brought that up in the staff meeting the other day about what great work you're doing. Those subtle things. Or you notice that they're really in need of a certain player on their team and you know somebody. Hey, I'm happy to introduce you to my friend over here in finance or wherever. We don't usually think of ourselves as that connector who can make that difference, but it's those small, subtle things that end up being significant to that team that I've noticed a lot of folks just don't even think are the options. So I throw those out there as options that we've recommended over the years to folks is if I can get more people thinking that way when they're encountering people, I can't say how many times that happens in a large organization then, but I know it's more than it used to if I can keep telling that story to people. That anybody can empower that broad-based action, can keep other changes going by noticing the commitment, celebrating it, and connecting them where you can, either in small or significant ways. So.
Yeah, the hook we place on that is look for the bright spots. Mm-hmm. Celebrate them and publicize them.
And a lot of people just don't think to do it. Mm-hmm. So that's your job as the CTO, I'm just down here.
I think you've also got a systematic problem, right? First of all, the experience people have to manage other people is very limited these days, so they tend to manage by numbers. And when I applied to become a general manager way back before IBM, I had to do a year in sales and hit my targets, a year in support and hit my targets, and a year in production, this is a software company, and hit my targets. And only then was I eligible to be a general manager. Because if you'd actually spent a year in sales and you couldn't pay your mortgage because you hadn't closed an order that month, you kind of understood sales. And if you sat on a support line, you couldn't take the average length of a call multiplied by this and the number of hours, it just didn't work like that. So you actually had practical wisdom to go with theoretical knowledge. We're now taking people through management school into management consulting, sideways into industry with no experience whatsoever. And therefore the only thing available to them is to manage through numbers or through direction or through formula, because they haven't got the experience to exercise judgment. Now, I think that's something we need to address in the educational system. I mean, I would ban people from doing MBAs until they've got 10 years of experience, for example. And you might even not go down an MBA because it's too case-based. And we need people to be able to walk the floor and have the actual experience to make judgments. I mean, you see this I've done a lot of work in the nuclear industry. You need to understand the nuclear industry. We were talking about this at the break, all right? You don't make, you can't just take theoretical knowledge of what it's like to handle core meltdown. Yeah, and we can see the consequences of that in Japan and elsewhere. In the Pacific, they still have evacuation plans in place for Tokyo, for Christ's sake, and it's still a significant risk, right? Anybody who had real experience in the nuclear industry wouldn't have made the senior management judgments that the guys made in Tokyo Power around that. So we got a long-term issue on that. I think in short term, we've got to stop talking about changing people, and we've got to start talking about changing interactions between people. One of the great wisdoms I got from Melissa Gerrara, who wrote one of the best books on complexity, she says, meaning exists in the interactions between people, not in people themselves. Yeah? And we're the only species, I mean, the thing growing inside you, all right, so I will not mention aliens, sorry, I did. Yeah? The brain will continue to develop for 2 to 3 years after birth. We're the only mammal where the brain continues to evolve after birth, which is actually why the womb has the problem with constriction and everything else, is because the brain has to have that capacity. Because our brains evolve in a social setting. The trouble is we then move people into an atomistic, isolated setting in work. We focus on individual performance. We assume that we change the people, the system will change as a result. The reality is if you change the system, the people change with it. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And I think we need short-term stuff about changing systems, changing interactions, increasing variety. And we need long-term stuff about changing the way we do postgraduate education so we increase diversity in the system.
So I'm curious from each of you, what is the most out-of-the-box thing you've done to create change in a group or organization?
My kids always ask me these most or outlier questions in my brain. I was like, think about that.
Nothing out of the box.
Defiance. Say yes and then go and do something completely different and not be afraid to be fired if it goes wrong. I mean, and that's why I wouldn't necessarily make things too safe. You need to find the people who are prepared to take risks. They're passionate about something. They don't mind being fired if it goes wrong, but they're going to do it. Yeah.
As a change agent, I think the most counterintuitive, out of the box, counterintuitive thing that I've seen done, I've done it, I've actually counseled people to do it once I saw it, was get out. There's a real risk as a change agent that you become a little too essential to the transformation of the group, and if you leave, it will die. But sometimes the group fails to change simply because you're there sort of taking that burden upon yourself as the change agent. We have a change agent, so that's check. We're done with that. So occasionally, if you look in the business where we've embedded people with teams, you can hang around a little too long, and it ends up preventing the team from actually making the change organically because you've got this shell of change, you've got this little protective layer. They say, oh yeah, you take care of that. So sometimes I just leave. And say, okay, you're on your own. They say, wait, where's my security blanket? It's like, no, you're ready. You do this yourself. Make the change real.
I think that's one of the most important points made so far, because if you want to actually facilitate people, you need to be scaffolding, to come back to my point this morning. When you go away, the building should stand up on its own dependency. I mean, some of the methods we're going to use tomorrow in the workshop, we developed in Denmark so we could facilitate in English, but they would speak in Danish. Because the rule on complex facilitation is the facilitator must not engage in the content. Yeah? You're simply there to manage the interaction so the content which people produce is their own. And too many facilitators get engaged in the content, give people examples, try and help them along, which actually means it creates exactly the sort of dependency you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah? And the trouble is some facilitators get their rocks off of it, creating that dependency.
One of the things that I've seen work really effectively for change is, especially if you have two groups, so imagine you have like a product owner and a technical account manager. In software companies, those two roles tend to really be at odds with each other. Take a week or 2 weeks and have them switch roles. So have the technical account manager be the product owner. Have the product owner go out in the field and be the technical account manager. And that allows each of them to see the conflict that they have or the relationship they have from each other's perspectives. And I've seen that as a powerful way to create the context for them to figure out what's broken between the two organizations or what needs to be optimized without actually telling them to do anything.
But you, April?
It's hard to pick. That's the weird part. I think one of the biggest struggles I had as a change agent was, to his point, was letting go of an official organized group that was supposed to make change, because I saw coming down the track the scapegoating of the group. So it was that individual thing at a larger level, and actually having to go out to the folks who were trying to make that change and say, we have to step aside as a group together, otherwise this other group isn't going to make the change that was necessary. That was probably the hardest for me, but I'm convinced it was the right thing to do. Because sometimes, like you said, that people get accustomed to the folks who enjoy creating the change, carrying that weight. and they get arrogant in the notion that, well, I could do that too. And it's hard to step away and not keep carrying that. But you face these as parents too. I keep doing their laundry because they keep saying they can't, so I'm going to keep doing it. And then eventually they go off to college, and you're shocked they have no. Yeah, you've crippled them.
I brought it home every vacation.
Yeah. So I think that's the hard spot, because a lot of change agents come from that place of truly wanting to be of service, right? Servant leadership, helping, assisting, and we have to be very careful at what point it becomes carrying people. Not helping them up, but actually carrying them. And you'll go there at some points, and the willpower to come back from that, because you'll go there. We all go there at some point, but the willpower to come back.
Do you have any strategies for change agents to help with that willpower? I mean, you were mentioning some in your talk. I don't know if others have found anything that helps them carry through.
I go back to what I talked about with the policy buffer is when I need to be reinforced that it's not just the thought in my head that makes sense, that I need to stop doing this or we need to stop doing this. I go to those people that I trust that see it that same way and bounce it off of them, and even a few of the biggest opponents to my changes, and go to them and say, I'm thinking of doing this, what do you think? And getting that feedback from that wide range to check it. I still get to make that decision, but I do that almost sensing, right? Going out and scanning a little bit to say, what does this look like, and how does that come, just to make sure I'm not missing a piece.
I think people also don't realize the extent to which bureaucracies can't cope with dissent, so they'll accommodate it. And I found that in IBM. If you actually did something which you were told not to, you often didn't get punished for it because they didn't want to admit you defied them.
Yeah.
All right? So I have an all-time record. I didn't fill out a timesheet in my 7 years in IBM. I'm really proud of it. I just refused. I never said no, I just didn't do it. And every year, this little band 6 used to come and ask me what I'd done so he could fill out my timesheets for them, because the bureaucracy didn't want to admit one of their senior staff hadn't filled that timesheet, so they did it for me. And after I learned this mechanism worked, I learned to use it extensively. Now, it helped I had some external reputation. But I think one of the things we need to do, you need to get change agents out into the world so they're validated externally as well as internally. Because as long as you're internal, you're subject to that control. Yeah? And the thing about the Agile community, there's lots of opportunities to get people on conference, get people on platforms, get them speaking, so they get some reputation. Then that gives them more confidence to actually defy. But you don't get away that sometimes you need to defy authority. Change happens through revolutions, not through reform. And that applies internally as well as the states.
Yeah.
I'd also say know yourself, because you have to recognize your own reward system. I tell the people that I mentor that intrinsically I revel in the success of others. And I've gotten in a little trouble around Focal for that in a couple of my 14 years here, because I haven't been carrying and waving some giant flag that has my name on it at the front of a program. I've made a dozen or two programs better. And in most organizations, that's been fine, but in a few years, that was trouble. So you have to sort of know where you're at. This feel I have of reveling in the success of all of you, I could get addicted to that and want to hang around and feel like I was the cause of all this, rather than being able to step back with some maturity and say, you're on your own. I'm happy with what I helped you become, and now sail on. So I think everybody's personality is going to cause that relationship to be different. But you've got to know going in that suddenly you as the change agent have become the major impediment to what you want to see true. And it's time to leave. Actually, a few days ago, it was time to leave then.
One of the things I pay a lot of attention to is Slack in the system, as a way of thinking about, do people have the space to feel okay about trying some things out potentially, or things not going 100%? Because when you're loaded to 100% or 110% of your personal capacity or the team's capacity, you intrinsically have this feeling that nothing can go wrong. We don't have the space for anything to go wrong or to do anything different. And to me, I can often see that when you go into a team and you can see just on their faces the fight, flight, or freeze. Are they trying to run away from the tiger? Are they trying to fight the tiger? Are they trying to fake their own death? And this is just sort of a natural place that our brains go to. And when we're in one of those places, we're not going to have the mental capacity to try something novel, to be even aware of what's going on, to be able to sense what's around us and appropriately respond. one of the sort of main anecdotes I've seen to that is Slack. That seems to allow a team to kind of come out of that place.
So we have a few minutes left, and I did want to open this up to the audience since I know the cards might have been in an obscure location. So please feel free to come to the microphones for any questions that you have.
This is the point that David and April made earlier. Change can be terrifying because to an organization. First, because it implies building a new narrative when you don't yet have the language to describe it, and perhaps building a new identity when you don't know that identity will be. And to Erik's point, it's terrifying because an intel could mean a reorg, right, or redeployment. And rather than being liberating, I may feel that actually is boxing us in. So can you comment on that?
Personally, I find lack of change terrifying. And different people, different orientations, different positions. Yeah? And part of that, I had a really good family. If you want good change agents, good families. Yeah, if you go up knowing you're safe, knowing that you can always go back, that actually makes you a lot more confident. Yeah? But also, I think one of the key things to learn is we live in a world which is changing. So you've got to change with it. Yeah, and if you're uncomfortable with that, find a passive job. Find a job where you can accept direction. You won't be, and there's nothing wrong with that. My sister, she's a systems programmer. She wants to do a job, go home, earn good money. She doesn't want to be part of an organization. She doesn't want to be engaged in management games. She wants to do a professional job and get it over with, right? If you want to change things, you've got to take risk and you've got to get comfortable with it. And there's no hiding from that. Yeah. It's risky.
Not changing is risky, right? So
there's also an old rule of hikers, by the way, is you fight cougars, you play dead with bears. So knowing whether you're facing a cougar or a bear in an organization is a key skill.
Hi, I'm not an Intel employee, I'm a guest, so I appreciate being invited. Thanks. I have a little bit cynical question. Instead of being a change agent, what about trusted advisor? Try to advise the line management to change. Let them worry about what to change, how to change. You be the advisor in a way, and let them worry about. Do you think that's more effective?
I think that's an opportunity that's open to people if you've got a leader who's open to the advice. And usually I think change agents are struggling with leaders who aren't open to the advice, right? So they've got plenty of advice for everyone else and are deaf to any feedback. So if you've got somebody who says, well, we're going to do what Stanford Design School does, you hug them and you stay with them and you serve them and you can be supportive of that because they might be willing to change, but
It takes time, it takes many years.
yeah, and so I guess that's knowing your boss, right? I have several folks I work with that I can go in and go, hey, have you considered this? You want to go try that? They'll go do that. With others, that's a hopeless ploy. It's those must be the bears and the cougars. So.
With Lou Gerstner, when I did leadership development for IBM, you could do that with Lou, you couldn't do it with Sam. And there was no way you'd even get through the front door with Ginny, right? So you need to know the leader. Some people here from Boeing work for Dennis. I know Dennis, he's a VP. Dennis is the sort of leader who you give advice to, you put in the right place, they'll come up with solutions. But a lot of times they won't. And then to be honest, I think one of the leadership skills is to listen to the cynics. Come back to your original comment, the cynics are the ones who care in organizations. The reason they're cynical is it matters to them. The people who just feedback what you want to hear are problematic. And that's the problem with advice. As leaders get more senior and more powerful, they end up surrounded by advisors who want to tell them what they want to hear. So I'm not sure about the strategy at all. I think it occasionally works under very limited circumstances, but otherwise I think it's potentially quite dangerous.
we can tie Enrique's question and the terrifying comment he made around redeployment and evaluation and all of this to this too, because I think I in support of that, one of the jobs I believe a change agent has is somebody who's at least on the boundaries of an organization, possibly well outside it. One of my jobs in your organization may deliver truth to power that you cannot, because you're terrified. okay? I came to Intel from a consulting position. I would not be fearful of going back to that position, so I can walk into a GM and tell the truth, and so far I haven't been fired. I've had some interesting run-ins, but I've never been fired. So
Now, I had that with a 3-star general in Washington, all right? So
Yeah.
we're doing Special Forces Small Group Command, which is an area I specialize in. At one point, this 3-star turned to me and said, would you go out and have a private conversation with my sergeant so you can come back and tell me what I need to hear from them? Yeah.
that's a smart leader.
That was a very smart leader because it wasn't happening fast enough. The reality is the sergeants couldn't challenge the general, but the external could actually come in and speak their voice. And that's another way that you actually achieve.
Yeah, so advisor, yes, but the sort of advisor that has fidelity and never just tells them what they
Yeah.
want to hear and represents people. Take the risk as a change agent on your back because you're temporary.
Yeah.
One of the tricks that I've seen work really well as a leader is if your team or the team you're part of is going out to lunch or dinner, go with them. Don't be a big part of it. Just kind of sort of hide a little bit in the background and just pay a lot of attention to what's said at the table. It's amazing what you'll hear with the same people, not in the office, over dinner and food, that can be hugely enlightening.
So my question is, especially at Intel, we oftentimes get change thrown at us from above or from the outside, and there's reorgs or the way we work or redeployments and teams disappearing and coming back and they're all around. So when there's all this flux going on from the outside, how do you do good change when people oftentimes are changed out?
Your role as a manager is to protect your staff from the idiocies of the senior managers. Now, I'm quite serious. That's one of your roles. If you're not prepared to do it, you shouldn't get into middle management positions. That's not your team's problem, it's your problem. It's the same as headmasters in schools and headmistresses. You see this problem, they actually protect the teachers from the sort of varying fashions on education. And this is reality. You're not going to change it. Organizations, if they don't get what they want, will change things. What you've got to do is create things which work, which become role models which change the pattern. Because one thing I will tell you is organizations won't disrupt a unit which is profitable, or which is achieving results with a manager prepared to defend it, except under very rare circumstances. So creating pockets of success, finding ways to hide things until they can become successful. Those are the key management skills in a large corporation.
It's putting the outcomes ahead of the compliance.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the essential things to bring out is, which do you want in this case? Because a lot of times we're pushed and pushed and pushed towards the compliance. Show me when I flip the light green, my light on that pile of stoplights where everything else might be red, but I flipped my light green, show me you moved into the intersection. And that somehow matters more as I get hit by a Mack truck from the side.
Larry Prusak, who I worked with in IBM for long, was a very wise guy, Larry. I remember somebody asking him a similar question from the floor, and he said, leave the company. And that was his answer to a lot of things. And he had validity, because there's a point. I realized it in IBM. When Lou went, Sam came in, and you could see Ginny was being lined up. I knew my days were numbered. Yeah? There's no way an organization run by people who want to control everything and manage everything by numbers, who have no flexibility to handle disagreement, that people like me could survive. Yeah, and that was one of the reasons I took early retirement and left. Right? Now, there comes a time when you've either got to choose compliance or leaving. Yeah, and that's a consequence of how many teenage daughters you've got can influence that decision quite considerably. But fundamentally, ultimately, you're going to face the choice. The thing you can't ever do is to say, wouldn't it be nice if life was like this? Because the minute you start to say that, you're moving away from a realistic position where you can change things to a point where you've got an excuse for not acting. So recognizing reality is a large part of just survival these days.
I think a big piece of that too is personally having options. Not being, if you're in a place where you think your skills are atrophying, or you're not building your reputation in the community, or you don't have sort of other people talking to you, knocking on your door, you're going to be in a place just almost like, if you're up to your nose in debt and you're trying to live paycheck to paycheck to stay in your house, you can get yourself in a job situation too. And I think being very mindful of that, it can be very freeing.
I think if it's a quick question, I think we can take it.
Okay. Well, so Intel is, a large corporation, and every time there's a quarterly, after every quarter, there's a large earnings report, right? And if Intel just is slightly lower than the analyst expectations and the stock will really go down. And that's, I think, our management's fear is that, you know, if we just change a little bit, take a little risk, then our stock price will go down to zero and everyone will leave the company. I don't know what your thoughts are, how we would deal with that kind of a situation.
Well, this falls under the disconfirmation, right? If you go and look at the 10-year plot of Intel's stock price, I think we all feel a certain healthy amount of disconfirmation in this. We don't like this, right? Where's the growth? And we're hearing that from senior management. We have to get back on a path to growth. The short-term, long-term thing that you're talking about is present, but I wouldn't paint management with rosy color here, but I would still say we have taken some short-term pain under the hopes that the longer-term thing will work. The danger would be the short-term management at nose length and say drive up the stock price by making ill-advised decisions in an unsustainable way, only to crash later on.
Which is exactly what IBM did. Yeah, and I think IBM is a role model for Intel because it went through the cycle earlier than Intel. Yeah? And they moved into services too late for services to really rescue them. They moved into consultancy too late for consultancy to rescue them. They survived because they had mainframe revenue, which kept them going despite multiple bad mistakes. Yeah? And that's a danger for Intel. And I think if you want to be a change agent, forget about being a change agent, forget about the organizational stuff. Find some really intractable problems and create something which creates something novel. Yeah, and then that's the way to change things.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Please give a big hand to our panel.